Um, Eva Rehse is the Executive Director of Global Greengrants UK, which is a participatory grant maker supporting grassroots environmental justice and climate movements. Before joining Global Greengrants Fund UK as its first full-time member of staff in 2015, Eva worked for Amnesty International as their international projects advisor and with Civicus and with Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. Eva's also worked with Scottish Biodiversity Forum, where she was part of creating Scotland's first biodiversity strategy. And she has an MA from Bonn University in Political Science and Sociology. She's also co-chair of the board of Edge Funders Alliance and a trustee of the Environmental Funders Network, and also a member of the Alliance Magazine editorial advisory board. So lots of expertise and interesting knowledge I'm sure Eva will be able to share with us today. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. I think this is actually a good order of speakers because I feel like we're on the totally opposite end in many ways to what we've heard. And I probably have more questions than answers, but I'm hoping that that will also help us with our discussion a little bit. So before I outline our approach to decarbonizing operations, I think it would be helpful to give a little bit of context of Global Greengrants Fund. And this here, as you can see, is our vision. So we are a small global charity working on the climate crisis, specifically with a climate justice approach. And as you can see here, we're really interested in supporting environmental justice movements. We are a participatory fund. That means that our decision-making lies with activist advisors who are based in the countries and the movements where we work. And we are truly global, and I'll show that in the next slide. But as you can imagine, as a participatory fund, working in this way and working so closely to grassroots communities, relationship building, trust building is really important for us. And that becomes harder when you cannot do this in person. And that's a whole conversation and a whole scenario we've been living for the last couple of years. But as you can imagine, also has implications on how we think about travel. And I will come back to that. So, when our advisors cannot travel to meet our grantee partners or scope for new initiatives in very remote areas, often there is something there about the way we work that we really need to rethink, and I'll share a bit what we're doing there. And that's especially true because a lot of the people we support are those who don't necessarily are in touch with other funders, Indigenous peoples, communities, young people. It's really important for us to build that trust. So just to show you what this looks like globally, when I say global, I mean truly global. And actually, since this image was created, we've opened up an advisory board in the Middle East and North Africa. We've got advisors in the Caribbean now, and we're also working on Central Asia and Central and Eastern Europe. So this is actually already a little bit outdated, but gives you a bit of an idea of the scope of our work. So that's the context in which we work. And I think it would be useful for me to just give some general comments up front that are guiding our thinking on our work and our own operations. And one is that we totally understand that everybody has an individual responsibility to tackle the climate crisis, but we are not about sanctioning individual behavior, and that also involves sanctioning individual organizational behavior. We're much more interested in systemic changes and how we can work with the grassroots movements we support to further systemic changes. So with that in mind, I'll share what we've done, but I'm also really here, like Jameson said, to learn and exchange with others on this. So, by the way, these are some of our advisors and grantee partners in Kenya working on mangrove restoration. We have an environmental sustainability policy, and that outlines that we understand that in addition to our work that we fund, we have a responsibility as a charity and also as the people within the charity to protect the environment. And that's sort of the starting point for us, from which we say we all have a role to play in this. And then how do we reduce our carbon and environmental footprints as an organization so that we become an environmentally responsible charity? So the language we use in that policy commits the organization to minimize the impact of our operations wherever that is possible. So we're also being realistic in that policy, and that we're all accountable to each other for the resources that we use in the process of working towards our mission. So what this means in particular, and where the big issues are, is obviously with travel, as you can imagine, right? So as I said, the in-person contact is really important for the trust building and the relationship building. And that happens with our advisors that work at country or regional level, but also with the staff and the advisors. And we understand that. So the first step we did was to understand how much are we actually traveling and what is the carbon implication of that. And I already shared the calculator we used for that to understand where we maybe want to be and what feels like a good trade-off between less travel, but also building relationships. And we decided on the basis of that information that we had that we would take certain steps. So for example, when we travel in Europe, then we take the train. And that means some of us are based in England. And so that means it can often take quite a long time to get, to example, to the European Foundation Center conference in Vienna. So, there is something there about, does that make sense, organizational sense for some of us to travel for days, and how can we continue the work as we travel? There is also an ask to us to not travel for just a couple of days. So, in previous jobs, I would fly to Kenya for 2 days, literally. And that was okay. And that was needed because I needed to run a workshop. We wouldn't do that at Greengrants Fund. So for us, it's really clear that if we go somewhere, we generally go there for at least a couple of weeks and we spend deep time there. And then you also start to decide, is this actually worth doing? Is it worth flying somewhere? Can I stay there for 2-3 weeks? Or is this work that we can do virtually? And I think this work that we can do virtually is becoming more and more sort of the starting point, rather than starting from when can I travel to this place. But we also have some very specific challenges around how we calculated this carbon budget, because one is, what's the baseline that we use? So when we started Global Greengrants Fund UK, I was the only member of staff for a couple of years. That was easy enough to say, for one person, it makes sense to have this budget. But now we're 5 people, and how do we ensure that this is equitable? So for example, if I take a long trip to India to meet with our advisors there and meet grantees, that means the rest of the organization cannot travel anymore for the rest of the year. And is that fair, right? So that's another question that we haven't necessarily fully answered, and that's because COVID happened. So when we were just starting with this work, COVID has really, I think, scuppered, but also helped a lot of this along, because we met our budget over the last 2 years, as you can imagine, because we didn't travel anywhere. But we are also getting better at working virtually with each other and working and connecting more virtually to our advisors in different geographies. So I think it comes back to this point that we actually need to radically change how we work, rather than sort of tinker around with a carbon budget. And one of the ways we're doing that now is we're in a strategic planning moment with our network of 200 advisors, and we're doing all of this completely virtual. And we need to find ways to build relationships in that way. Another challenge is obviously office space, and we talked about this already, and it's been coming up. So we, as I said, we're 5 staff currently in England, Scotland, and on the European continent. And we had always had a desk or a couple of desks in shared office spaces. And now we are completely virtual. And that was a decision that we took, and we've put in place many ways to work well with each other in this way. But we still have a desk in an office space in London as sort of the center of where we can meet when we do meet. And we are trying to meet quarterly when that's possible, and travel restrictions allow that. But we were also really mindful of choosing an office space that shares our aims and is also transparent about it, and uses not just this sort of the language that hides what they're actually doing, but actually outlines this is how we're operating. So we the office space we are with has a sustainability policy. We studied that before we made the decision to move in there. They are already have completely gotten rid of single-use plastic, and their catering is all meat-free, and they're committed to being carbon neutral by 2023. And we can argue about carbon neutral and net zero and all of these things. But at least for us, when we reviewed office spaces, that was the one where we felt, well, they're actually walking this talk. And we feel, even though we're almost never in that space, we're giving them money on a monthly basis. We want to feel that we're doing this in the right way. So I think transparency is really important. And of course, we talked about the homeworking, and we have a homeworking policy. And as part of that, we started thinking about how we can minimize impacts at that level. I'm really keen to study the documents that people have shared, because we haven't necessarily figured that out. But there is also a question about how prescriptive do we want to be? Do we want to ask all of us to get a green energy provider? Is that where it goes? Or, you know, do we have to be, as an environmental charity, do we have to say that? Or is that encroaching into, you know, people's lives in too much of a way that we don't want to and feel comfortable with? That one we haven't figured out yet. I'd love to hear what others think. So in the end, I just wanted to share some thoughts on carbon offsetting. And actually, it didn't come up as much as I thought it might in the conversation here today. But we, as you can imagine, a lot of what we fund could be, or is offsetting carbon, and could be used for carbon offsetting. And we do get approached a lot from funders who are interested in carbon offsetting and would like to give us some money to do that for them through the work that we support, for example, with indigenous communities in the rainforests in the Amazon or the Congo Basin. And we, as a charity, don't think that carbon offsetting as a concept is compatible with the concept of climate justice, because it allows people in some parts of the world to continue living this unsustainable and polluting lifestyle at the expense of sacrifice zones around the world. And a lot of the work we directly support, happens in those sacrifice zones, like the Amazon. So it feels that we cannot take money on the one hand to sort of permit this lifestyle to continue, when on the other hand we're paying people to then clean up the mess. And I love this quote that I've heard someone say, that it's like a smoker saying that they've given up, but they're paying a healthy person for their clean lungs so that they can continue smoking. And I think that's sort of, for me, summing up where I have issues with carbon offsetting, and knowing that nature-based offsetting relies heavily on land use in the global south in particular, and that really shifts the responsibility for emissions then from the wealthier countries to those places as well. We also know that secondary forests take decades to actually become effective, and even when they are effective, they're less effective than primary forests. So really, it is more about the systemic changes, again, that I mentioned at the beginning, right? We can't uphold those systems that have commodified nature. We need to change them. And I think that's where we see both our work and our organizational responsibilities in decarbonizing, is that we ultimately need to cut emissions. So as I said, as an organization, that means we're traveling less. We are working in different ways with each other. We're doing the little things like catering meatless, being in an office space that promotes that kind of philosophy. And then in our work, we push for those systemic changes. So that's really where we're sitting. It's not so much about the individual behavior and practice, so that is important. It really is about advancing the calls for just transition and for climate justice in the way we think about decarbonizing our operations.
Great, thank you so much, Eva. That's lots of food for thought, I think, for all of us.